Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We might get started. Thank you very much for being here tonight on this fabulous night. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting tonight on the lands of the Garnaut people and pay my respects to their elders past and present and to any that are in the audience tonight. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to what is an exceptional night, and I'd like to appreciate the very many people from different organisations which are here. If I could just mention some of our partners, Latrobe City and indeed the Wellington Shire, and in fact Councillor Michael Whelan from Bass Coast is here as well. Councillor White from Latrobe is here, as well as Councillor Clancy, of course. The Mayor of Wellington, Councillor Hall, and Councillor Crosley. I'm sure I've missed two or three other councillors, and my apologies if I have. And I'd also like to acknowledge and recognise that tonight has been sponsored by and appreciate to the Latrobe Valley Authority, and welcome their CEO, Karen Kane, who'll be talking to us shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is a very exciting night for the Gippsland Climate Change Network. We are an organisation, not-for-profit, which is engaged in providing renewables and climate change mitigation within our communities. You can assist tonight by buying a raffle ticket. In our raffle, there's an organic prize out there. All the money raised, 100% of it goes into renewable projects that we're doing around the area. So if you'd like to do that, that's great. If you'd like to go onto our website, gccn.org.au, you can get a download of our annual report which tells you all the things that we're doing. But you're certainly not here tonight to hear from me. And to officially welcome you here, before we welcome Ross Garnaut to the stage, can I please make very, very welcome the Mayor of Latrobe City, Councillor Dan Clancy.
Bit of a rock star introduction, Councillor McCubbin, thank you. I too would just like to start by recognising that we are meeting here on the land of the Bracklong people of the Gunai Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's my job here to welcome you, and I'd just like to also just start by saying you should also buy a raffle ticket. Very, very important fundraising, they're only $2 each. My job as a welcomer is to have you all here in Latrobe City is really, really important for us. We're actually quite lucky to have this discussion that's happening tonight, and the presentation and the comments and the questions that you all have happening here. It's quite fitting that it happens here in Latrobe, and we're really, really excited that we've been chosen to host this evening. These are important conversations to have. We know that, you all know that. There's a lot of, as Darren alluded to, there's some elected officials here, but as I look around the room and I recognise so many faces, so many important people that are in the room, and you're here to have important conversations because it's important times. And we know that certainly for Latrobe City, we're a transitioning community. We're transitioning not just economically, we're transitioning socially as well. And we have to work through all the things that we have to do to transition. We have to work out our place in this new world, as it sometimes is forced upon us and sometimes we lead that change. So we're competing sometimes against market forces, sometimes we're competing against ideologies, sometimes we're looking at science, sometimes we're looking at beliefs, sometimes we're competing, sometimes we're arguing, sometimes we're agreeing. And we actually just need to recognise that this is a time of importance, that we need to listen to each other and we need to have these conversations, and that's why we're really, really appreciative to have that here tonight. I've always said when we talk about energy production, and I'm no expert in this, I'm not an economist, I'm not a scientist, but I am a realist, and I believe that we need to have many eggs in many baskets. Not one egg, not one basket, not all your eggs in one basket. And I think that they're the sort of conversations that we're going to hear tonight. We believe here in Latrobe City that there's a place for renewables. We believe that there's a place for traditional energy production that we've had in the past as well. We believe that there's a place for hydrogen production. We believe that there's a place for carbon capture and utilisation. We believe that there's many eggs in many baskets. We don't have all our eggs in one basket, and we're happy to listen and be involved in these important conversations. I think that as we have these conversations, it's important to have them together. And I think it's great to see so many people here to engage in these conversations and listen to Professor Garnaut tonight. I think as John Lennon once quoted, or Yoko might have written it and John said it, was that if you dream alone, it's just but a dream. But if you dream together, it becomes reality. And I think that's a really, really important thing to remember, that if we do this together, that we can make it a reality as we move towards a future. So from my point of view, welcome, enjoy your evening, enjoy the conversations, and have a good evening. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're very fortunate here, I think, in the Valley to have the Latrobe Valley Authority who are sponsoring tonight and have certainly assisted us in the transition as we move forward. I think we're also very fortunate to have a very far-sighted CEO, and I'd like to now to introduce our special guest tonight. I'd like to welcome Karen Kane of the Latrobe Valley Authority. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you very much, Darren. And I have to say, what a pleasure it is to be here tonight. I'm pretty excited because there are not many times we have in our daily lives, each week, each month, where we have the opportunity to listen to and learn from someone as esteemed as Ross Garnaut. I hope people understand the privilege that we have tonight. This man, generous to be here tonight, has worked all over the world, continues to work all over the world. An ambassador, a researcher, a writer, a lecturer, a thought leader, a provocateur, an activist, all the things and an economist, I might add. On top of that, Ross, I don't have time to go through tonight all of his achievements. All I can tell you is that they are significant. And how wonderful for us as a community to have somebody of his stature and knowledge here with us tonight. We feel very privileged, Ross. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us tonight. I'll make one last statement. You have your book here tonight, and I'm encouraging people to buy that and to read. Reading and learning is very important for everyone in every community, and I encourage you to do that. But I think one of the lines that I'm really interested in is about the opportunity for Australia as a superpower, and how we can learn from what you have learned, Ross, to become that. But I want to take that a bit more local. So here in Gippsland, in the Latrobe Valley, we have a very proud and strong history of energy production and many other talents and experiences. And we want to be the centre of that future. And if we work hard, and I want to take Darren's point and Dan's point about collaboration and innovation, and together we can do that, but we've got to work together and we've got to learn from each other, and we have to speak to each other, and we have to learn about all the things that matter to us, but also learn about different opinions and different ways of thinking, because that's the only way we'll do it. So I'm very proud to be here tonight, just as a local, but also as the CEO of the Latrobe Valley Authority, which I think our transition work is so important. So thank you very much, Ross, and really a very, very big welcome to Ross here tonight from everybody, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Dan, and thanks to you all for being here. It's very good to be back in the Valley. I've been in these parts quite a number of times over the last decade, and I've always been impressed by the way the people of this region are determined to make a great future and create a great future. And one of the points I'll be making tonight is that the region has huge assets in building that great future. My book, Superpower, Australia's Low Carbon Opportunity, begins with an update of what we've learned in the 12 years since all of the premiers and chief ministers of Australia, plus the Prime Minister, all of the governments of Australia commissioned me to do the first of my reports, and I updated that review 3 years later, 2011, for the Multi-Party Parliamentary Committee on Climate Change. The first thing I do in the book is look at what we've learned since then. Quite a lot of time has gone since then, and it's been a pretty messy time in terms of Australian policy. We've lost some opportunity by heading this way and that with contradictory policies, but we've learned a lot of other things as well. And I'll just very briefly summarise that. I draw the conclusions that one of the things we've learned is that Australia is very well placed to do extremely well in the low carbon world to which we're headed. I'll also draw a few implications for Gippsland and the Latrobe Valley, and all of you will have more knowledge of that than I will, so I look forward to keeping half of our time for discussion of those issues at the end. In the dozen years since I pulled together what was known from the science of that time about the effects of climate change, a lot of work in science since then, and it's broadly confirmed the average expectations, but has reduced uncertainty about it. So that's the main development in the science in the past 10 years. There's less uncertainty, but it hasn't greatly changed the expectations of the outlook. There's been a little bit more focus in the science on the extreme dangers, risks of things getting out of hand at relatively low temperature increases. But broadly, the science has concluded that if we can hold human-caused increase in temperature to less than 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5, we'll avoid those worst effects. The scientific focus on the risk of runaway outcomes if we let it get too far has led the international community to focus on an objective of trying to hold human-caused increase in temperature as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. Been very important developments in our understanding of the ethics of climate change. Climate change has only been understood, the science has only been clear on its practical implications for a few decades, and it's a new kind of problem, and human ethics grow out of human experience, and this is a sort of problem that doesn't come within the normal experience. The effects of what we do now will be felt for many generations. Some of the worst effects might be felt several generations ahead. They'll be felt all over the world and not only in a local community. And we've had to think through how we should think about that as an ethical question. And been big developments of that in that over the last decade. Most powerful and important, I think, was the careful encyclical of Francis, Laudato Si. He drew upon the world's best atmospheric physicists, the world's best scientists. He brought them together as a committee, and so the encyclical is based on the very best science. That's a starting point, and then it traces through the ethical implications of that, from the appeals to the ethical positions of the 1/3 of humans who profess the Christian ethic in some form, also the 1/4 of humans who profess other Abrahamic faiths, but also appeals to the ethical systems of people of other religious beliefs or of no religious belief. And he draws very strong conclusions that within any of these ethical traditions, we have a very big responsibility to stop the damage to life on Earth and to other people that would come with unconstrained growth in greenhouse gas emissions. So we've become clearer about the ethical implications. Also been important developments in the international framework for cooperation on climate change. Between my two reports, we had a pretty big upset. There had been an attempt, first of all, at Kyoto in 1997 to reach an agreement amongst all the countries in the world about how much carbon we could afford to put in the atmosphere without great damage, and then to allocate responsibility for reducing emissions. That was all based on the idea that because developed countries, the rich countries, including us, had put the carbon dioxide in the air that was already there, that it was responsibility first of all for the developed countries to start reducing it. At Copenhagen, at the end of 2009, there was an attempt in a United Nations framework. Most of the heads of major countries were there. An attempt to reach a stronger version of that Kyoto Agreement. That failed, and that was a big disappointment at the time. But out of the embers of that failure, the United States President Obama, pulled together the leaders of the four most influential developing countries on that issue, the heads of government of China, India, South Africa and Brazil, and they quickly worked out a new approach. It wasn't in time to save the Copenhagen meeting, but subsequently that new approach was embodied in the way the United Nations sought to reach agreement, and that finally manifested itself in the Paris Agreement at the end of 2015. And Paris Agreement begins with a commitment of all the countries on Earth to take action that's necessary to hold temperature increases caused by people to less than 2 degrees, as close as possible to 1.5. But it didn't try to reach a binding legal agreement in one session. It said each country will make voluntary commitments, and we know that they will not add up to a solution, but every few years leaders will get together again and assess how we're going, and then revise those targets and put pressure on each other, ask questions of each other, and in that way we will gradually move towards the desired outcome. That's been working reasonably well, although there was an upset when the people of the United States elected a president who doesn't much believe in international cooperation, and so it's been a bit of a challenge for the international community to keep momentum going. So far it has, but one has to acknowledge that what happens in the world will depend a fair bit on what happens in the United States in the presidential election at the end of next year. But we're still working within that overall framework. I did say that at Paris all of the countries on Earth were part of the agreement. Initially, 2 countries didn't sign on, Syria and Nicaragua, but they were both a bit preoccupied with other problems at the time, but within a few months they did sign on. So all the countries that are members of the United Nations have signed on to that agreement. But by far the biggest changes have been on the economics of climate change. When I did my initial modelling in the review that was published in 2008, that was based on the most detailed modelling and the most long-distance, forward-looking modelling that's ever been done on Australia before or since. And I had to make, when I say I had a very good team of people. In the end, I had the modelling, support in the modelling by the Treasuries of Victoria and Queensland and the Federal Treasury, and the very strong group of economists who work on modelling, the Centre of Policy Studies then at Monash University, now at Victoria, all of those working with me, with, in the end, the Federal Treasury providing a lot of the computing grunt to bring it all together. And we had to introduce assumptions about likely changes in costs of energy from different technologies. And my group and I personally consulted with people at the frontier of working on renewable energy technology, and not only in Australia but in Korea, Japan, China, the United States, Germany, Britain. And after all that consultation, I authorised writing into the modelling an assumption that the cost of solar energy would fall by a few percent per annum. Now, at the time, I was criticised by a lot of people saying it won't fall at anything like that rate, and all the official forecasts of Australia at the time were for much slower rates of reduction in costs. But in the 10 years after I did that work, costs of solar photovoltaic equipment fell by 85%, and they've kept falling steadily since then. We've been using fairly large, worthwhile quantities of solar energy through photovoltaics now for 38 years, and we've found that over that time, every time total global consumption of solar energy, purchase of equipment, has doubled, costs have fallen by 24%. Well, there's been a dozen doublings over that time, and there's still no sign of that rate of reduction falling. We're still getting a fall of 24% every time we double the global use of solar energy. It won't keep going at that rate. We won't end up with free solar energy, but one has to recognise that there's no sign yet of that reduction falling. Something similar, but not quite as fast, has happened with wind energy. Something similar is happening with the storage of energy with batteries. And we've become much cleverer at bringing together different sources of renewable energy and storage to develop stable power supplies with a renewable base. So all of that has made the cost of the new energy very much lower than we expected it to be. Another big change has been more widespread understanding around the world of the very large role that can be played by the capture of carbon in plants and soils. This has always been part of the story, but there's now greater awareness among scientists and practical people working in the climate field that this can actually play a major role in the global story of going to zero net emissions of carbon. And an implication of the Paris objectives is the whole world will have zero net carbon dioxide emissions by the middle of this century, 30 years from now. A lot of scientific work has drawn attention to how big a role the capture of carbon in the landscape can play in that. I mentioned in the book one fact that I've only learned over the last year, that in the top couple of metres of soil on land on Earth, there's more carbon than in the whole of the atmosphere and in the whole of the biosphere, in all plants and animals. So with a moderate increase in the amount of carbon in soils, you could actually absorb a very large amount of carbon. So that's also contributed to reduction in the costs of getting to zero net emissions. Now, there's one other big change that's helped the economics, and that is the cost of capital has fallen to lower levels than the world has ever known. We've only got good data for Britain back to the time that Elizabeth I raised the funds to fight the Armada, and since then, on average, strong government treasuries have been able to borrow at about 5% interest rate plus inflation. It's fluctuated a little bit around that, but that's been the average. Well, in the years since I did my reports, the cost of capital for sovereign borrowers, for governments, of developed countries, has fallen to about zero. And that's not just a short-term temporary thing, the result of some fashions in monetary policy. It's the result of big changes in economic structure, in the relationship between savings and incomes, and the relationship between investment and output, that's made savings more abundant, so that real interest rates are genuinely low, capital is less scarce. That makes the cost of investment in new activities much lower, and it means that the costs of investment in new activities that involve a lot of capital and not a lot of operating costs are much lower, and it systematically favours the low emissions energy, which are nearly all capital with relatively low operating costs. Now, I've been following all these things quite closely for 10 years, and I began to realise around 4 years ago that all of these changes were adding up to very big advantages for Australia as the world moved towards net zero emissions by the middle of the century. And in 2015, I gave the annual lecture to the engineering school at the University of Adelaide. I called it Australia, Superpower of the low carbon economy. And since then, I've been focusing on this issue and expanding my understanding of it, and it's that understanding that's in this book. But there are two main reasons why we have exceptional opportunity in the zero emissions world, and some subsidiary ones, and everything points in the same direction. The biggest reasons are that we've got by far the richest resources of renewable energy, solar and wind, but other sources as well, of any country. And what's relevant in economics is comparative advantage, resources relative to the size of the domestic economy. But even in absolute terms, we've got richer resources than other developed countries. And when you compare it with the size of our population and economy, it's an immense superiority. You don't think the sun's great all the time in the Latrobe Valley, and Jane and I driving down came through rain that we hadn't been expecting. But when I was doing my first report, I received a visit from the head of the German solar program, which at the time was by far the biggest in the world. Since then it's been overtaken by the size of the Chinese program. But he was very distressed. In preparation for the meeting with me, he'd been studying the solar resources of Australia, and he said, I've just discovered that I'm trying to run the world's biggest solar program, and I've discovered that the worst place in Australia for solar energy, it's not the Latrobe Valley, it's the west coast of Tasmania. And he said, that's better than the best place in Germany. So if you were a German, you'd be thinking, this is a great place for solar energy. But it's the combination of diverse wind resources and solar that together give us a very big advantage. And here in the Latrobe Valley, of course, you've got excellent wind, onshore wind in the right places, and then the extraordinary offshore resource. Germany thinks its best renewable resource is the wind of the Baltic and the North Sea, but in Bass Strait and off the east coast, you've got a better wind resource, so they can't even win there. And here you've got the advantage that all of that is quite close to major transmission nodes, whereas in Germany it's badly located a very long way from the big industrial centres and industrial loads of power in further to the south in Germany. So as the world goes towards zero net emissions towards the middle of the century, all countries will be drawing power from renewable sources, and the country with the richest resources can produce power substantially cheaper than others. And this will be an advantage for domestic manufacturing that isn't there in the coal and gas energy economy, because gas and coal, except in the Latrobe Valley, are readily exportable. So we've got the best metallurgical coal in the world for making steel, but it's no more expensive to use that coal in Kobe, the great steel centre of Japan, than it is, well, in fact, it's a lot cheaper to get it to Kobe than to get it to the iron ore resources of Western Australia. And it's cheaper to get the iron ore from Western Australia to Kobe than to bring it around to the metallurgical coal of New South Wales and Queensland. Similarly with gas, we used to have the cheapest gas in the developed world by far, when we had that abundant supply from Bass Strait, and that exceeded domestic demand, added to later by other resources, and that led to our gas prices being relatively low. But over the last decade, the development of a huge gas export industry at Gladstone in Queensland means that the price, just as with coal, it's no cheaper to have to use gas here than to use it in Japan or China or Korea. It's no longer an advantage for domestic manufacturing. But it won't be like that with renewable energy, because it's very expensive to move renewable energy. And you can, and we will, export renewable energy. There's two big projects in Northern Australia, one from Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory, good solar country that will take power by undersea cable to Singapore. Another project in the Pilbara region of Western Australia will take wind and solar power to through to Java in Indonesia. But the transmission underwater is very expensive, and so it's going to be much more expensive power there than it is in Australia. You can turn electricity into hydrogen and transport the hydrogen, but again, it's very expensive. You use a huge amount of energy, you use half the energy in liquefying the hydrogen. Hydrogen will be a very big and rich industry for Australia, very important where we've got renewable energy. But the most profitable uses of it will be for manufacturing here in Australia. It'll be much more expensive to use Australian hydrogen in other countries, and that's an advantage in the low carbon world that didn't exist in the world of coal and gas-based energy. A third advantage that I discuss in the book is that we've got exceptional opportunities for geological sequestration of carbon, and here you have nearby extraordinarily good geological structures for sequestration of carbon, for capture and storage of carbon dioxide wastes. And we know these structures well because we've spent 50 years taking gas and oil out of them. A lot of the costs of geosequestration, if you don't have an established gas and oil industry, you don't have a history of geological studies, a lot of the cost is learning what the structures are. Well, we know that from Bass Strait. And there'll be two ways of making zero emissions energy in the zero net emissions economy. One will be using renewable energy, another will be using fossil energy and capturing and storing the emissions. Coal doesn't have a future beyond the middle of the century if we can't capture the emissions, but in the right locations it will have a future in some uses if we can economically capture the emissions. And the final big advantage that Australia has is that just as we're exceptionally well endowed with renewable energy resources, solar and wind, we're exceptionally well endowed with opportunity for growing biomass and for capturing carbon in our landscape. I've got a chart in the book that compares Australia with other countries in woodlands, areas of woodlands per person compared with population, and we're much larger than other developed countries, and even larger again compared with developing countries. And in Australia, that adds up to a very big opportunity. In the low carbon world economy towards which we're headed, biomass is going to be very valuable. It's going to be the basis of a lot of chemical industries that are now based on coal and gas and oil. And so if you've got low-cost biomass, you've got, especially if you've got low-cost energy, you've got a base for a wide range of chemical manufacturers. And Australia should have a very big advantage in that world. And it happens that in the Latrobe Valley, in Gippsland, generally you've got extraordinarily good opportunities for growth of biomass. And closely related to that is our exceptional capacity to capture and store carbon by managing our soils, our pastures, our woodlands, our plantations and our forests in other ways. To get the most out of this, so we'll have to develop systems that reward farmers and other owners of and managers of land for the contribution they're making, and the world will head in that direction. We've got a fair way to go to build up systems. It's already done on a small scale, and that will be continued under the Morrison government's Climate Solutions Fund. We need that to have other sources of funding, including international sources of funding, to be really rich. But I note in the book that my estimate in 2011 that rural incomes from carbon farming could become as valuable to rural Australia as the wool industry. I say in this book that is a radical underestimate of the possibility. It'll be very, very much bigger than that. It's a huge rural and provincial industry. There are ways in which these different advantages can be brought together. If you've got low-cost energy and abundant biomass, then you've got an exceptional opportunity in a range of chemical manufacturing industries. And then there are other manufacturing industries that just require the low-cost energy. For example, ammonia, a big item in international trade, a basis of nitrogen fertilisers, as well as explosives, about 16 million tonnes traded internationally. We only account for about 1% of world ammonia production at the moment. At the moment it's made from natural gas, mostly made from natural gas, but the zero emissions way to make that, we can still make it from natural gas and capture the emissions, or you can make it from renewable electricity, run the electricity through water, which separates the hydrogen from the oxygen in water, and you've got the hydrogen, and then with more energy, combining the hydrogen with the nitrogen in the air gives you ammonia, and then you can go further than that and convert it into urea and other fertilisers. It should be a huge industry in Australia in future, and the places with access to low-cost energy will be the places where that should happen. Another way in which the different advantages can come together is using this geosequestration, the geological sequestration opportunities of this region to capture the emissions from manufacturing activities based on biomass. And if you can do that, then you've actually got negative emissions. You're actually taking carbon out of the air. You take carbon out of the air when you grow trees in a plantation. You process that, it generates carbon dioxide. If you can capture that and put it underground, you've got negative emissions. And that's going to be very valuable as the world tries to come to grips with the final stages of moving to zero net emissions, and play our cards right, and we'll be rewarded for the capture of the emissions as well as having a good manufacturing industry. Well, briefly, a few words about I've already said some things about the assets of this region in this low-carbon economy of the future. Australia has immense advantages, and within Australia I think that the old centres of transmission networks, the Latrobe Valley in Victoria, Newcastle in New South Wales, Gladstone in Queensland, Port Augusta and Whyalla in South Australia, Collie in Western Australia, the main industrial centres of northern Tasmania, have huge advantages. Being at the centre of a transmission network allows you to bring a variety of renewable energy in from other places to complement it with your domestic energy, and gives you a very strong base for low-cost energy as a basis for industry. In this region, you've got exceptional opportunities for low-cost storage of energy in the mountains to the north. I've done enough work on all of this to know that the opportunities there are cheaper and better than in this, and less contentious and problematic than in the Kosciuszko National Park and the Snowy region, and that becomes another big asset for this region. The combinations of being the centre of a strong transmission network and having all of the skills, the education and training facilities that have been built up, the electrical engineering, the electrical trades built up around electrical industry will be very big assets in building the new economy. I've mentioned the location adjacent to very rich geosequestration opportunities. Under the coal bed, you've got an exceptional resource of hot water, with the coal acting as an insulator, stopping heat getting out, and that's potentially a source of energy, but also hot water for other industries. And over dinner I was learning about some of the fish farming opportunities associated with use of hot water from that source. I've mentioned the wealth of this region in biomass and opportunities for carbon sequestration. I've mentioned that although your sun's not as good as Mildura, it's not hopeless on a world scale and can be part of the mix, and some of the wind resources are genuinely rich. And then the transmission systems that link the Latrobe Valley to other parts of Victoria allow you to draw on low-cost renewable energy from other sources. So and location, not very far from the world's most rapidly growing big city, actually is also an asset. I was in central Queensland, where they're interested in the role that their resources can play in a low-carbon future. Was why they invited me up there to spend some time, and there is a lot that they can do. It's the best solar country in Eastern Australia, roughly due north here in the centre of Queensland, from here in the centre of Queensland, and that will be a valuable resource. But it's a disadvantage to be way out in the middle of Queensland rather than 150 kilometres from all of the commercial strengths and industrial strengths of the city of Melbourne. There's a very big job to be done in defining the region's sources of competitive advantage. I've mentioned some in this discussion this evening, but there are a lot of others. And by focusing on the special advantages of the region and the combinations of advantages, you'll be able to identify the best opportunities for going forward. None of these new things will happen without forethought, preparation, without innovation. And innovation usually requires government support in the early stages. The innovating companies take risks that others in society benefit from, and so we need support for innovation. We've had that for energy through the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. We need it in building the new industrial economy of Australia to take advantage of the new opportunities. We saw that there's some willingness to start down that track in the hydrogen strategy announced by the Council of Australian Government's ministerial meeting last Friday. So, Karen, I'll leave it at that and be ready to answer questions for as long as people want to go.
Thank you, Ross. I think you can hear me if I speak like this. We do have a microphone down the back so that Ross can hear your questions. We'll just have a short time for questions, after which we're going to draw the raffle. We've got a book giveaway to do as well, so if you haven't got a raffle ticket yet, you can get one down the back. But we need some questions for Ross, so here we are. Yeah, no, Alex, you're always first, but I'm not going to go there, okay? I will in a second though, mate, don't you worry. Alex is on our board, so I know him well. Anybody else before Alex? Yes, let's go to Wendy. Yeah. Do you want to bring that down? Ian? Microphone? Wendy down. Yeah, there you go. Good, that's... We've got two microphones there. There we go. Yeah, there we go.
Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. My question is about Latrobe Valley being the hub and being the area of transmission. We saw Port Augusta when it closed that the energy companies for renewable energy flocked to Port Augusta. They made quite clear statements that we're open for business, we're ready to accept renewable energy. They also put in the big battery. Now, you haven't said anything about a battery for Latrobe Valley. We saw 2 years ago, I think, where we had a diesel generators put into Morwell, which to me is a signal to say, to me, common sense is put a big battery where we put diesel generators. What's your thought on that idea?
Yeah.
And a statement by the Latrobe City or the area of Latrobe Valley, the new Latrobe Valley, do you think a statement to the world to say we are open for renewable energy will actually have companies start looking at the area?
Yeah. Port Augusta, I know well. I visited a lot of times over the last dozen years, and the mayor had me speak at a meeting there about a year ago, and he told me then that there were now new jobs based on renewable energy in Port Augusta than there had been in the coal generation in a few years ago, and that's taken them by surprise. Just examples of the types of industries. It's desert country. It's not like this Garden of Eden, and there's no water. But they produce all of the tomatoes that are produced that are used by coal stores everywhere in Australia, from Cairns to Perth. And they do that, but they put up a private company, put up a solar thermal facility that takes seawater and distills water out of it, so you get pure water that's used in the greenhouse. You don't use a huge amount of water in a greenhouse because it's recycled. It's just the water that gets captured in the tomato, I suppose, that disappears. And but then they need a uniform temperature, so the solar thermal provides the heating through the winter nights, and also the air conditioning on a very hot summer's afternoon to keep the temperature within the range that you need it in. And there's 300 jobs there, and 300's quite a lot of jobs. You have to be a big city not to notice 300 jobs. And then it's a major centre. It's got good solar resources, but good wind resources. So there's a lot of solar and wind located there. They've got the big battery down the road, a little bit south of there. And the battery's done a terrific job in South Australia. A company that I chaired actually was head-to-head with Elon Musk, and they got the contract. We think our battery probably would have been better, but theirs is terrific. And he promised that he'd do it for free if he couldn't do it in 100 days, and we couldn't match that, so he won the tender. But South Australia now gets more than half of its power from renewable energy, and that percentage is increasing rapidly all the time. You now have a Liberal government that's just as supportive of the new energy as the Labor government used to be. In fact, it's extended things further, and both sides of politics are now vying to see who can add the most bits to this story. But the battery has helped to make South Australia the most secure power system in Australia now, and it absorbs surplus power when it's abundant in the middle of the day from solar, especially at the weekend when there's not much use for it, and then every night you've got a huge amount of wind in South Australia, and it tends to be stronger at night when there's not much demand for power. The battery soaks it up and puts it back at
So when you ask a question about here, though, so what do you think there's a room for a battery here?
Yeah, I think that batteries are going to be part of the solution. They're not going to be. I mentioned pumped hydro storage. That's part of the solution. Pumped hydro is better when you've got multiple hours you've got to cover. When you need to stabilise a system with bursts of power, the battery is the best. You need them both, and this being near the centre of the transmission network is the best place for a big battery. Yeah.
So I'm sorry to cut you off there, Ross. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much. Alex, I will go to you. I'm sorry. I just had a think not to give you the first question. I do apologise.
Alex Arbuthnot, thanks Ross for your very enlightening address. I want to ask a question about food production and the claims by some that by 2050 we cannot feed the world. Now, my question is about wheat. Up at Walpi, up in the Mallee, Silo, and you should be aware of this, I guess, Silo did research for 10 years on putting carbon dioxide into the wheat crop. The average increase in production over the 10 years was 21%. The other question regarding food, surely if we have the changes predicted, the tundra regions of Canada and Russia will be growing a lot more wheat, surely.
Yeah, there'll be a big change in where agriculture works, and some places will be helped and a lot will be hurt. Current agricultural systems are built around what used to be the good agricultural areas, so it'll be hugely disruptive, and unfortunately hugely disruptive in Australia, because the southern latitudes of Australia will suffer a drying, because all the atmospheric physics says that with warming the westerly wind systems in winter will go further south, and we won't get as much of that. From what I hear, this region is better off than the rest of southern Australia because of local climate systems. But I discussed some of these issues a bit in the book. Food prices are going to be higher, so if you can still grow, if you can still grow food, then you'll do well out of it. Water is going to become more valuable and scarce. Water for agriculture and energy can turn any old water into water that can be used in agriculture, and we'll be focusing more on really high value crops that can carry the cost of recycling water or transporting water over a distance, or in some places desalinating water. So higher food prices will create, and lower energy prices will create a range of new opportunities. But where the climate remains good for agriculture, and from my reading of the atmospheric physics, this region will retain a lot of advantages, then that's going to be another advantage with the changes going forward.
Excellent, thank you, Alex. I think there's a question over there, yes.
Hello, thank you very much. I haven't read your book, so my question really may answer the book, and I don't know. I found, listening to you, it seems that your modelling doesn't include any restraint on consumption. It implies, to me, I thought, it implies that we find new way of renewable in every possible way. So we're going to continue to consume, throw away, overconsume on food bars. I mean, I don't know if you've got a comment. I'm sure you have a comment on that. Yeah. And that's certainly an area of interest, because I would have thought that in order to survive longer, we might have to consider to consume less rather than more or as much as we do now.
But I think we can say that if we move to zero emissions energy, either by using renewable energy or at low cost capturing carbon from old energy, then climate change will not be a reason for consuming less energy. There may be other reasons, but climate change will not be a reason for consuming less energy in the zero emissions world. In fact, I say in the book, Australia will be producing and using 3 times as much energy in the early 1930s as it is, electricity as it is now. Now, we would be, I do actually mention some recent studies that show that we'd be healthier in the developed countries if we ate less food. I've tried to eat a bit less lately and do feel healthier. But if we shift our energy systems to zero emissions energy systems, climate change won't be a reason for reducing consumption. There'll still be a lot of other reasons, including the excessive obesity of Australians for doing so.
There you go. Okay, yes.
G'day, Ross. G'day, Ross. Yep. So, thanks for coming first. How has privatisation affected consumer prices of power, and how has it affected or delayed united federal policy approach to climate change and energy systems?
Yeah. Well, I do say in this book and in my earlier work that we made quite a big mistake in some states privatising, in some states corporatising them, breaking up the old electricity commissions and telling them to act like profit-maximising businesses. We made quite a big mistake in doing that without thinking carefully through what you have to do to regulate the behaviour of a private monopoly. It doesn't matter so much in the generation of power, although even there we do have a problem of too little competition. And the ACCC has done a report on that, pointing out that wholesale prices are higher than they would be because there's not enough competition. But the big problem is in our network. In Victoria, in some states it's a private monopoly, in other states it's a government monopoly where the leaders of the business have been told to run it like a business. And you can't have a private monopoly giving a good outcome for the public unless you regulate prices. It's actually quite hard to regulate prices efficiently, and we didn't give enough thought to that. Back when I was a student, and that's an awful long time ago, we used to be taught in microeconomics that the biggest mistake you can make in regulating a private monopoly is to regulate price on the basis of rate of return, because that introduces a huge incentive for wasteful overinvestment, and prices keep going up because they invest more and get a certain rate of return on that, and that gets added to prices. Well, we've done that in Australia. We made a mistake that the regulators would not have made if they did the same Economics 2 course that I did in 1965.
It's wonderful to watch both of you get so excited about economics. You know, it's just we're all just watching it. It's just fantastic. I'll keep going. We've got Rod here. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, Rod.
Ross, just a question on hydrogen or coal hydrogen that the local community are experimenting with at the moment. So, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, hydrogen's got a big role in the future, and I've had quite a lot of discussions with Alan Finkel, the chief scientist, as he's worked on that. And hydrogen's going to play a big role as a base for chemical inputs into chemical manufacturers. It's going to play a big role in energy, and it's going to play a big role in reducing metal oxides to metal. So for Australia as a whole, the last one's going to be a very big one, because Australia accounts for 1.25% of global carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions, but our exports of iron ore, when they're mixed with coking coal in blast furnaces, accounts for 3% of global emissions. And in the zero emissions world economy, it's going to make sense to do most of that processing in Australia using hydrogen, and that will be zero emissions. So we can contribute to removing 3% of world emissions just from that one industrial activity if we process it at home. So hydrogen is going to play a big role in this. There's been a lot of discussion of export of hydrogen, and I know that's the basis of the plant here. That's, as I said, the hydrogen is going to be much more expensive at the other end than here, so I don't think there's going to be huge exports of hydrogen as a basis for industry in Japan and Korea and China and Europe, but as a basis for energy and for transport, it may very well be, especially to countries which have very weak renewable energy resources. And Japan and Korea are the outstanding ones. They've got very few opportunities for solar and not so many for wind. Densely populated places where you can't get land for these things, but the resources aren't very good anyway. So I've already mentioned how it's expensive to liquefy and transport hydrogen. You can turn it into ammonia, and that's much easier to transport, but that's another industrial process to turn it from hydrogen to ammonia, and then you've got to turn it back at the other end, so another set of costs. So again, it will be done. It'll be probably an important industry in Australia, but I think the biggest opportunity is actually to use the hydrogen in manufacturing and processing industry in Australia. Now there's two routes to zero emissions. Hydrogen is going to have to be zero emissions to have a long-term future, and why people are interested in it is it can be zero emissions. You can use the traditional fossil energy to make the hydrogen, and that's what's currently being proposed in the Latrobe Valley, and then you can capture the carbon emissions and sequester it in geological sites. The big question there is how expensive will the capture and storage be? The other route is to use renewable energy to run it through water, and that splits the hydrogen from the oxygen in the water molecule. And there you've got nothing to capture. The exhaust is water, and in most places of Australia we can get rid of that pure water fairly easily. So there's going to be competition between these two modes. The actual production of the hydrogen is cheaper from coal or gas, but then you've got to add to that the cost of storage. We don't now know how cheaply we can make storage in geological structures on a commercial scale. We know that it works technically. At the University of Melbourne we had a very nice project from down in the Otways that shows that technically it works fine. We don't have many examples of commercial scale sequestration around the world. Those that exist are quite expensive. But any new technology, when you first do it, it's much more expensive. Costs will come down. I think it's really important for us to soon test that and see how low we can make the costs. If the costs end up being very low, then in favourable locations like this, close to big known geological structures, very favourable structures, it will have a role. But it's going to depend on costs. We won't know what those costs are going to be until we've learnt from doing it.
Good, we've got time for a couple more. I haven't gone far down the back there, so maybe if you get over there, that's right, Joe, yes, okay, then we'll go further down the back. We might find some people. There's a gentleman over that side. Right, Joe, we might just do a couple of quick ones, Ross, if we can. I know, quick questions, quick answers, here we go.
I'll do my best, I usually...
Maybe switch it on there.
I'll shout then.
Yeah, shout, that'd be great.
Thank you. I'm glad you're looking after your health because we need your brain around for several decades to come. On that topic, that comment before about wheat that Alex made, I think that same CSIRO report showed that you have greater output but lower protein, so the quality of the food is not necessarily improved by increased CO2. However, my question
about carbon sequestration. Along the 90-mile beach, it's causing quite a lot of disruption to the local communities, and they're not particularly happy about it on the whole. There seems to be a lot of ongoing exploration and closing beaches and ultrasounds and stuff. You made the comment that we already know there's massive places to store. It's sort of all not quite connecting up. Do you know more about what's going on there? Can you explain? Because we're hearing that it's never going to be commercially viable. You're suggesting it might be one day. The community would like to know. What more can you tell us?
Yeah. I didn't... You know more than me about some things, and I didn't know that they're continuing to test the geological structures. I do know that there's a lot of favourable structures where gas and oil's already been taken out, and so I had presumed that they were the natural places to start with. I don't know about that exploration on the coast, and I don't think the issues there are very different from any kind of mining. You do have to study the environmental impact, and some environments are more suitable than others for mining type or activity that's potentially disruptive of the environment. So that has to go through the normal processes. On the question of whether it will be commercially viable, yeah, I think at the moment its costs are very high. But you would have said the same thing about solar 20 years ago, or I did say the same thing about solar 10 years ago. Costs come down with learning by doing things, and I think we can say confidently it's not going to be a low-cost solution. It's not going to be an economic solution everywhere. But where it may be economic is where you've got very good geological sites, not far from good locations for manufacturing activity and other use of either biomass or fossil coal and gas and oil. And it's always seemed to me to be the case that if it works commercially anywhere in the world, this region is going to be one of the better places because of the location alongside the geological structure.
Yes, we've got a couple more questions there. So we've got some down the back there. Lorraine, can you go over there, please? Maybe get some ones further to the back. I've been conscious I've been picking on people in front, and there's a few people down the back. I will, of course, once we finish this off, Ross will be here. We'll also be selling the book, so the book will be available. Ross will be there to sign copies of the book. I know Ross has got an early start tomorrow in Ballarat, so he's talking to their community about their opportunities. So he does have to leave, but I'm sure he'll be available for a few quick questions. All right, where are we at? Over here. Thank you for standing up.
All right. Given that it's fairly early days in commercial production of hydrogen, I'm interested in your stance saying that it's not going to be commercially viable to liquefy and ship it, because we have a pilot program right here in the valley at the moment that is doing exactly that.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it's not going to be commercially viable. I'm saying that the hydrogen is going to be much more expensive in Japan and Korea than it is here, because the basic physics tell us that you have to use a lot of energy to convert a hydrogen gas into a hydrogen liquid. You have to get it down to a very low temperature, much lower temperature than for natural gas. Natural gas liquefies about minus 160. You have to get almost down to absolute zero to liquefy hydrogen. You use a lot of the energy along the way, and that's basic physics. That will always be the case. It will always be more expensive, much more expensive, to use Australian hydrogen in Japan or Korea. That means there'll be advantages for industrial purposes in using the hydrogen for industry here rather than in countries like Japan and Korea. I did say in my talk that in other uses, other than industry, where costs and international competitiveness are crucial, but in other industries like using hydrogen in cars, in peaking power generation and so on, where we use gas now, I think Korea and Japan will be importing hydrogen for those uses. I think Germany, I chair the International Advisory Board of the German-Australian Energy Transmission Hub based at the University of Melbourne, and have a lot of contact with German industry, and they will be importing hydrogen, but I don't think it will be for the mass industrial uses. It will be for uses where costs are not so important. Some of the household and community power uses and transport.
Excellent. Good idea. Okay, yeah, can you, yeah, okay. Ian, down the back, sorry, sir. Okay, over there. Yeah, you.
Yes. Hi, Ross. Good to hear you. I think, and as we've implied, the carbon sequestration is as important as transitioning to renewables and so on. You didn't make any mention of offshore carbon sequestration in seagrass and the propagation of that. I wonder if there's good opportunity off the coast of Victoria or Gippsland even, and if you know of any projects and if they can get going as soon as possible.
Well, I said quite a lot about carbon in pastures and soils, and the same is true of carbon on the seabed. And the most productive sea plants are very much more productive than any sea plants in turning sunlight and carbon dioxide into the air into biomass. Algae is 8 times as productive as sugarcane, which is just about the most productive of the land-based crops. So I personally haven't studied that. I do know it's very important. We can gather that some locations will be much better than others. Places with a long continental shelf will be much better than others. Some of the Victorian coast may very well be in that category, but I'm aware that it's potentially very important. I know that there hasn't been anywhere near as much research on that as on land-based, soil-based sequestration. It's important, but I don't know enough about it.
Good. We'll have one more. Lorraine, you want to find someone down the back there? Maybe the gentleman beside you over there. I'm sorry for all those other people with their hand up. I do apologise.
My question is, I agree with everything you're saying about how many great opportunities we have here in Australia, and there's a reduction in the price of electricity and all those wonderful things. My concern is who's going to end up owning most of this, because I'm seeing our dairy industry, our wheat industry, our food, all being foreignly owned. So is that what's going to happen here in the end too? If it all ends up foreignly owned? And what is the benefit to us as a result?
Well, to answer the second bit of the question first, there's a lot of jobs and a lot of incomes for Australians, and a lot of income from supply of services and goods to the new industries, and a lot of jobs in the new industries. But who owns them? It's a bit up to us. We don't have great traditions of supporting homegrown enterprises, but there are in this space a lot of active Australians trying to build businesses. How well they do and how much we end up relying on foreign companies depends to a fair extent on us.
Excellent, well done. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please put your hands together for Ross Garnaut? Ross, can I just get over here, if I may? I'm assuming. Ross, just a small presentation. We really do appreciate the time spent tonight. And ladies and gentlemen, please, at the end of the night, we will be having an opportunity for Ross up the back there. You'll be able to talk to him. He's got copies of the book. I have read the book, not all of it. I'm not quite through it yet, okay? But it's an excellent book. It's an excellent book. And as you can see, Ross approaches the subject from a simple case of the practicalities of it. He's not one side or the other in terms of we have to go towards a low carbon economy. He absolutely sees that, but the book is an absolute revelation. So please get a copy of the book. You'll really enjoy it. I did. Ross, on behalf of the people of Gippsland, we'd like to present you with some products which will say you'll make a biomass transformation into another product, hopefully, and that'll be good. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please, another round of applause for Ross.